of amendments were introduced, and the consultation period has gone on for about a year, and people have had opportunity to have input, and it came together in the form of a bill. But then within a matter of days, we were asked to accept 18 pages of amendments. The Chief Electoral Officer had not had time to read them. Members on this side of the House had not had time to go through them and look for detail. And so, again, people are saying, well, why would they want to push that through? Why would they want you to approve 18 pages of amendments when you didn't have any chance to look at them? When a year of consultation is now destroyed by a pushing of an 18-page document of amendments that had to be passed immediately. So again, that raises the suspicion, the concerns, and the questions that people have. We've also heard other members talk about the third-party advertising, and again, if this is an act that everyone on the government side can support, then let's give it the time that it needs for people whose taxpayers' dollars we're spending have a chance to review it and to respond to it. Another component of this, and I will come back and speak to this later, but it has to do with the access to personal information. And that alone will be one of the greatest deterrents to us having more people engaged in the election process, in the voting process, in the electoral process. Because there are many people who want their own personal information protected. And allowing that information to become available and distributed to members of any political party is an invasion of their privacy, and it's something that will cause them to be disengaged. And I will come back and speak to that in a minute. But I want to also talk a little bit more now about the process. And what we're seeing with Bill 59 is not unlike what we saw with Bill 100 in the fall, and most recently with Bill 17. And it's that introducing a bill, introducing it late in the session, hoping that people will be anxious to leave, so they'll push it through. I mean, it's a strategy, but it doesn't work. But it's been tried. It's being tried again it was tried with Bill 17. And you know, I've had questions asked of me as recently as today at noon about Bill 17, about the process that was used. And again, I can't answer the question. And the question that was asked was about ramming something through. And thank you, Mr. Chair. The process that's being questioned is ramming things through without giving it due course and without giving people opportunities to ask questions and to speak to it. For example, with Bill 17, we know that the member from Halifax-Clayton Park introduced amendments to Bill 17. And those amendments were lined up exactly with what the Minister of Health had stated earlier on when she spoke about Bill 17. And that was that she was hoping, what she wanted was to see the passage of the bill, the definition and the details of the scope of practice, and the negotiations of the tariff agreement all coming together, all coinciding to come together and happen at one time. A very noble position. Everyone understood that. Everybody agreed with the minister that that's the way things should happen. However, the process got flawed when over 30 groups came before law amendments to say, look, let's just hold off a bit. And I think of all of those that were there might have been only 3 who didn't have the same ask. And their ask was exactly what the minister had said she wanted to have happen. It was exactly what the amendments that the member from Halifax-Clayton Park had put forward. It did not change the intent of the bill at all. It was not a money matter at all, but it was a process. And so the question is, why, when people ask me, and they'll ask you, why did that have to be pushed through before the things that the minister said she wanted were in place? You know something? I don't have an answer. Nobody has an answer, because there is absolutely no rationale for doing what was done with Bill 17. And we heard from the presenters who were here that it was only a delay until those things came together. The amendment that the member from Halifax-Clayton Park put in was for a 2-month delay. And it could have been a win-win situation for the minister and for the government and for all of Nova Scotians. It did not have to be a win for any political party. It should have been a win for the people that I've just identified, because the pharmacists, the people who are using the pharmacies, the minister, the members here, all were looking for the same thing. And it would have been a wonderful announcement for the minister to come out and say, this is a position I had in the past. There have been some delays in the negotiations. We know that we're looking at a July 1st date, so we will delay the passage of this until all those conditions have been met. That didn't happen. So again, I go back to that old phrase that I use: in the absence of information, people think the worst. People have no idea why this government wanted to delay that, unless, of course, the suspicion starts to mount. Is there something there that the opposition have missed? Is there something there that the pharmacists have missed? Is there something there that the taxpayers have missed? And when you don't know the answers to those questions, you raise serious concerns. So here we are again with Bill 59, trying to use that same process of ramming something through on short notice, when amendments that have been presented only strengthen it and only clarify it and only help answer the questions that people are asking. So one of the things that concerns us on this side of the House is that process. And that's 3 times that I can name, and there probably will be more. And there probably have been more. So it does not do anything for the credibility of the government. All it does is raise anxiety, raise frustration, and build anger. And, you know, one of the things that we're hoping to do through Bill 59, and we're all hoping to do it, is to engage more people in the election process. And, you know, all of us have been on the doorsteps, and all of us have campaigned, and all of us, obviously, who are here have been successful. And I think we would all agree that one of the biggest disappointments in any election is in voter turnout. And, you know, we look at the list of electors in our constituency, and we want to encourage all of them to get out to vote. And at the end of every election, there's always that disappointment. Municipal elections are even worse than provincial elections. School board elections are worse than that. And it's that apathy that people have that we're trying to overcome. We want people to understand, be engaged, participate, and be seen to be part of making a final decision or part of a decision. So this whole business of putting a barrier up so that people are less anxious to participate is counterproductive. We have an obligation to the people in our constituency to represent them. And they have an obligation to voice their opinion and to come out and say who they want to be that representative. And, you know, if voter turnout in some elections had been different, there may have been some of us who weren't here. We don't know that. But we do know that the people in our constituency would have had a voice and they would have felt a sense of ownership. One of the things that we have in this country as a privilege is to be able to vote. And many people are not engaged, and there are a number of reasons why. But we also know that one of the reasons why people don't often get engaged is because they don't understand what the election process is all about. They don't realize that they can have a voice through their elected member. And so the only voice we hear from many of our constituents is to complain after the fact, to complain about the government that's been elected, or to complain about why their MLA is not able to do something for them. And quite often, those people we hear from complaining are the very people who did not get out to vote. So we have to do something to engage more people. One of the things in this act that I mentioned that I believe is a deterrent to that is the sharing of personal information. It is a privilege, it is a right, but it's also a personal decision. It's a personal decision whether you're going to vote and for whom you're going to vote. And many people still want to keep that very private. And so if they believe for 1 minute that any information about them is going to be shared with any political party, they withdraw. And they say, I don't think I want to get involved in this because I don't want my personal information shared with 3 or 4 political parties. So immediately, having that contained in the Act, we are absolutely putting a barrier up, and we are discouraging involvement in the election process. And that's exactly what we're trying to overcome. And for that reason, I think it's important that the amendments that are there and the terms and conditions in the Act have a more thorough review and a better understanding of the implications of the decisions and the implications of the terms and conditions that are there. And you know, Mr. Chair, sometimes people put things into a policy or they make a decision and they fail to think about who's going to be impacted by that, either positively or negatively. And after the fact, when people start reacting to it, it's too late. And so that kind of a discussion about who's going to be impacted and is it going to be positive and is it going to be positive for everyone, that needs to be had before it's enacted, before a decision is made, or before it's put into a bill. And I believe that this is one of the things that needs to be have a very clear definition and be thought out before we allow that kind of information to be shared. One of the things that we talk about with respect to elections in Nova Scotia, in addition to the poor turnout on election day, on voting day, is parts of our generation that are not engaged. And we often speak about, you know, our young people aren't aware of, they aren't involved in, they don't understand, they don't perhaps respect the process. And during the D250 activities, I had more than one occasion to meet with the chairs of that, former premiers McClellan and Ham. And the conversations that we had were about engaging people in the democratic process. And as the Minister of Education, of course, the reason they were talking to me was trying to find out where in our public school system we have attention to the democratic process. And we have failed. We have failed in that particular part of our curriculum in Nova Scotia in recent years. Some of us, and some of you, I'm not the oldest one in the House, will remember Mr. Chair? Thank you. Thank you. There used to be a course in high school called civics. And some people here may have been a student in that course. I see somebody nodding their head. Thank you. I appreciate that. And anyway, that was at high school. And that course no longer exists in our high school curriculum. What has happened is that somebody believed, and in fairness to whoever made the decision, they believed that we should not focus all of our attention on democracy and civics and the election process in one course, in one grade, in 1 year. So what the curriculum folks did was to take some components of civics and spread them out. And in the elementary grades, at the upper elementary grades 4, 5, and 6, there would be some mention made and some attention given to democracy and to elections and to the different levels of government. But it was not, it was not a concentrated chapter or component of their program, but there was reference there to it. And the expectation was that then when students get into grade 7, 8, and 9 into the middle or junior high years, that teachers there would build on what had been presented at the elementary. And so in that age group, junior, middle, and junior high school, there would be another component that spoke to some of the things in civics and in government. And then, again, when students moved on into high school, there was an expectation that what they had learned in elementary and what they'd learned in junior middle would be used, and they would build on that when they got into high school. And, there's a global history course that is there. Students must take a global, but it doesn't have to be global history. And so the fact of the matter is, Mr. Chair, that students have been able, over the last, I would say, 25 years at least, to go through public school system and know very little about our democratic process. And so when I was meeting with Chairs McClellan and Ham, we talked about that. And we recognized that there needed to be some change. Some things that have happened to try to supplement that would have been a model parliament, and some of us have been to the model parliament as MLAs, and we bring high school students in, and they get to see, on a weekend, they get a 3-day crash course on politics and democracy in Nova Scotia. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity, but I guess my argument here is the base on which they have to build when they get to that model parliament is pretty weak. And they really have not understood. And I'm sure that I'm no different than other members in this House. You have people who call your constituency office and they have a question or an issue or a concern. And they don't know if it's municipal level of politics or provincial or federal. And when you try to explain it to them, they don't even understand then. They just see it as government. And so I think we've done a very poor job of educating our young people about the different levels of government, who's responsible for what. And if we use the public school system as a venue to do that, we would have a very captive audience. We have taken many programs, Mr. Chair, into our public schools, and we have provided education so that our students understood whatever it was that we wanted to encourage. Healthy eating, healthy foods, for an example. I can remember going to buy groceries and my kids had no idea what was on the label of the food, you know, what the nutritional facts were about that food. They go shopping now, and that's the first thing they look at. Or they come home into my kitchen, and the first thing they do is take something out, and they say, Mom, do you realize how many calories are in this? So we have done a good job of educating, and we did that through the public school system. We've taken other programs. We have taken drinking and driving as an example, and used the public schools and used the students in our public schools to make them aware of and to educate them about the dangers of drinking and driving. We've done it with smoking. It is the opportune environment if we want to help students understand and learn something new. And so I believe that it is the opportune place for us to do our education on democracy, on different levels of government, on the election process. And so when that generation moves out into the workforce and they reach the age of 19 and they're eligible to vote, they have a better understanding of what they're doing. We have seen people drag young people to the polls to get a vote, and they have no idea who they're voting for. They may not even know what party that person belongs to, but they can be pretty sure that the one who drove them there is the party they're supposed to vote for. And they have no idea what the platform of that particular party was during an election. And I think that's sad, because the process is a good process. It's one that should be respected, and it's one that we should have as many people in this province engaged in. So we have a huge mountain to climb to get people knowledgeable and to get people engaged in the process, so that on election day, our voter turnout is not as dismal as it is now. One of the things that we have to avoid is putting anything in the way of making that happen. So not only do we have to take advantage of educating our kids through up through school, we also have to make sure that we don't put anything, and so we get them excited, we get them educated, they understand the process, they're eager and they're keen. And so then an election comes up, and they know that if they go and vote, there's going to be a record that they voted, there's going to be a record of who they are and personal information, and then all of that, of course, now rests with the Chief Electoral Officer. But do they want every party in the province to know that about them, about themselves? Some of them may not. Some adults who are voting now will not vote if they think that personal information about them is going to be shared. And so on the one hand, we're working to educate and engage and get people to participate, and on the other hand, we're saying, but when you do, we're going to share your personal information. And so somehow those two have got to work together, and right now they're counterproductive. I believe that in the public schools, we know that we have to do better, and I believe that the Department of Education, through the minister, can look at that and can look at ways to help take the, quote, civics part of curriculum down into our public schools. You know, there are certain graduation requirements, and if we believe that understanding, respecting, and engaging in the election process is worth anything at all, then we will make sure that kids have to take a course or a component of a course It's a graduation requirement. And then they will come out of high school with a better understanding of what elections are all about. And it's unfortunate, and this is not putting blame anywhere, but as I said, over the last 25 years, I believe, we have drifted away from a civics course into a smattering of little bits along the way. And I would encourage the Department of Education and the Minister to follow up on that and to make sure that there is some discussion with students and with parents and with teachers about including something, strengthening our curriculum in some way. Now, I'm not being critical of having some introduction at elementary. I think it's important because elementary kids certainly know when there's an election going on and they have all kinds of questions to ask. The sad part of it is, if they ask their parents who don't have any better understanding than they do, then they don't get the answers that they should be getting. So we have a responsibility in our public education system to make sure that they do get the questions answered and that they're answered accurately. So if we look at those two different sides of the scale, on the one hand, we need to help people better understand and encourage so that they will participate. On the other hand, we need to take away anything that might be a deterrent to them participating and to them voting. And I think once we have established a balance there, then I believe that we will have achieved what we want, that we will have informed citizens going to the polls, participating in the process, being knowledgeable about what they're doing, and that is our goal. And I apologize, I may need another drink. But this is water.
If you need something else, I'll get it.
So I will wrap up here because I am losing my voice. But what I want to say is that I would ask that the government consider the amendments that I believe will be coming forward, which. Thank you. No, you can take it back.
You got a captive audience, Karen.
If this is an exchange for asphalt, I'll give it back to you. That we do consider the amendments that will be coming forward, and we do allow this to have a thorough review, and that we do not push it through for the sake of saying that we passed the bill. Passing the bill when everybody agrees that it's the strongest bill possible is what I remember this House is all about. And so I would encourage government to do that. Thank you very much.
I recognize the member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't expecting the previous member to suddenly lose her voice and be up quite this early, but
you're not getting the halls. I don't care what you say.
That's right. That's right. You know, the nice thing about committee of the whole is you can get up like 40, 50 times if you want for 10 minutes at a time. So I'm not terribly worried about that. I thought, you know, Mr. Chair, it might be worth, since the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island isn't able to get up and talk about this himself without the approval from on high, I thought it might be worth starting with some of the comments he's made himself during his academic career on this various issue, and which, oddly enough, as you go through some of the papers that the honourable gentleman has written, he seems to change his mind from year to year on his position on things. So you know, it's worth starting. In fact, as the member was an MLA, I'm sure many members will remember his quote that if you can make liver good, you can make democracy good in Nova Scotia, which he made as one of the members of the Democracy 250 Management Committee. You know, and that's exactly the issue here, Mr. Chair, is that what we want to do is make democracy good here, and we have before us an Elections Act which has questions. It's been 22 years, I believe the minister said, since, if I'm quoting him correctly, since the last major amendments and revisions to the Elections Act. So it baffles me that the government would introduce this bill. It baffles me, Mr. Chair, that the government would introduce this bill towards the dying days of the session and then hope to rush it through without giving public comment when, you know, there are plenty of other reports that the government has delayed, such as the natural resources strategy and other items, that many of which it is delayed because it has indicated it wants to hear government comment on, or public comment. So why would we not want to hear comment from the public on this, especially when there's already some issues that have been raised? A number of members have already pointed out the fact that the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island had the other day to the media had commented on the possibility of the government falling, and that's the rush to get this through. You know, and boy, that was certainly a bit of a concern. You know, he talked about how in the Westminster parliamentary tradition, a government could fall at any moment. In fact, well, any moment. But in fact, the honourable member was, of course, a professor, still is, I guess, a professor of political science himself. He would be fully aware that since 1925, only one majority government in the world has fallen on a non-confidence vote, and that was in 1979. And I'm sure the member knows this, and it was Prime Minister James Callaghan after a few defections, and we ended up with Margaret Thatcher. So the fact is that, you know, Mr. Chair, that the member seems absolutely sure that this government is at risk of falling. Well, that's only going to happen if a few members suddenly defect. And so if he knows, you know, Mr. Chair, he's talking about the savage Liberal government. The savage Liberal government never came down on a confidence motion, and he's fully aware of that. So, you know, Mr. Chair, he can't even come up. The member can't even come up with an example that's accurate about an example that of a majority government falling on a confidence motion. I certainly would be. It's certainly become that much more troubling to me as I listen to the member about perhaps his when he's professor, and maybe it is better that he's here, of course. Let me quote from a student review of the honourable member, which maybe speaks to this issue. In fact, no, the member will like the beginning of it. It says, yes. Pereira is an awesome prof. Right, that's good. Actually, it wasn't Zach. However, he reminds me of a bumbling fool, which he is, but it's funny. Every day he comes in and you expected him to fall down the stairs or drop his papers. He was a great prof who took an interest in his students, and he really helped me in the second semester. However, I only had to go to class 3 times. He was so easy. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that it doesn't surprise me that he thinks, no, Mr. Speaker, I would never read the bad reviews. I thought that one was quite a charming review. But it certainly explains the fact why the honourable member seems to think that the government is going to fall or could fall at any moment, even though it has a majority in the House. And that was the best example. That was the best example the member could give to the media the other day while we were standing around listening of why there was a rush to get this Elections Act in. When the media asked, why is there a rush to get this bill through, it was because in the Westminster parliamentary tradition, the government could fall at any time. I don't think there's anybody in that room that honestly thinks that the government's going to fall between now and the fall session.
Well, they could resign, though. All the backbenchers quit.
And then a few moments ago, or I guess a couple of hours ago now, the Minister of Justice apparently went out and was asked the media what the rush was, and his answer was equally as bad. He said, apparently he said to them, well, it would be nice to have the Elections Act in place before the by-election so we could test it. Well, the problem with that is the chief electoral officer already said, well, the premier has said that there'll be the by-election in question will happen this spring, and the chief electoral officer has already said that any changes in this act wouldn't be done that quickly anyways. So that doesn't make any sense, the reason that the minister gave as well. So from that perspective, we now have two reasons from the government, two very different reasons as to why this act needs to be rushed forward, and neither one of them holds water. So that is truly, truly troubling. You know, if we look at this act very specifically, there are a number of concerns in this, and they are concerns. The leader of the Progressive Conservatives seemed concerned that we had not brought the issues forward, but of course we have. And we have brought them forward to government, and they haven't been addressed yet at this point. And specifically, there are a number of concerns in the bill, and many of them are around wording. In fairness, many of them are around wording. It's the point where, you know, we all felt we were getting there, and there are a number of members who were part of conversations the other day with government, and, you know, we were working towards getting this done and getting the wording fixed up, and yet that seemed to have come to an end all of a sudden, which was bizarre. If we look at, for example, you know, there's been much talk about the issue of providing the names and birth years of people who have voted and collecting that data through Elections Nova Scotia and providing that to the parties. Well, we need not go any further to be concerned than the fact that the very beginning of that section in the Act has a clause that exempts this Act from the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Well, if there was nothing wrong or nothing untoward with doing that, you wouldn't need to exempt this act from the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And so when there are members of the public who have expressed concern over that provision, I think it's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate concern. I haven't heard from members of the government examples of where that provision exists in other elections legislation, and that's not to say it doesn't. But we haven't heard any examples of it, and I haven't found any at this point. But maybe they do exist. But it would be good to know where exactly those exist, because this seems to have suddenly come in the 18 pages of amendments as part of the changes that were proposed. And any change that in the Act that is prefaced by an exemption to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, as it is here in Section 44, is troubling without an adequate explanation. And in fact, no explanation at this point has been given to that. And so, you know, I don't think that it's an unreasonable question to ask for clarity on that. I don't think it would have been unreasonable to allow the Chief Electoral Officer to speak to that issue and to express her feelings on that particular issue. I don't think that would have been unreasonable to do. A number of the issues as they relate to third-party advertising were, of course, addressed. There's no question about that. But and I certainly acknowledge that. But in fact, when those amendments came forward, some wording clarifications were suggested by the official opposition, and those we've yet to see any commitment to see those addressed as well. Particularly around the distribution of communications with members, and also about how third parties are registered, because there's no point in having a third party registration if those registrations are not made public and are not live and active at the time. If you find out that all the different third parties, whether they're chambers of commerce or an environmental organization or a fishing organization, it doesn't really matter what the type of organization it is. If you don't find out about those until 3 months after the election, it defeats the point of having them registered in the first place. You need to have the commitment in the legislation that those are that those registrations are available immediately upon registration. And that, again, is another suggestion that we made to the government last week for changes to the legislation, which we have not heard back from and not had any feedback one way or the other on that. So it is absolutely incorrect for the government to suggest that we have not put forward items that have come back. And in fact, we provided those comments before law amendments even began. When those issues were being dealt with, and yet there's been no response back to that, and the amendments as proposed still do not address that very critical issue of how that registration is dealt with, when the registration is public, how it's accessed, and so forth. So while the amendments go one step in addressing those issues, and I certainly give credit to the fact that they do that, they certainly don't go anywhere near far enough, and they don't address some of the concerns that we have expressed around that. Because of course, this is not a bill like so many bills that come before this House that should be addressed in regulations. Regulations done by Governor and Council in other bills essentially allow the government to move the intent of a bill back and forth as need be. That is not the case in this situation. It is not something that you'd be concerned about if things were governed by regulations in a bill like the Elections Act, because of course it would give cabinet control over changes in that, and that's why, to the government's credit, it maintains the tradition in this act of having pretty much everything done in the act. But there are things that if we look, there are other issues that it is worth addressing in here that seem to be left unaddressed. We had talked the other day about the fact that the chief electoral officer becomes an officer of the legislature, much like the Auditor General. This is something that we certainly support. It is something that I think makes a lot of sense. But it surprises me. In fact, it surprises me quite significantly that the government would move quite rightly to make the chief electoral officer an officer of the legislature, that the government would place that person in a position that they have a lot more, that they would report directly to all elected members, and yet at the same time would not wait for the feedback. In fact, at the same time would first introduce an act before the chief electoral officer's report's even in, and then after that wouldn't provide time for that particular officer to review the changes, and then when 18 pages of amendments come in, not even give the chief electoral officer time to review and provide comment to the legislature on those before moving forward. That seems to fly in the face of the government's intent to make the chief electoral officer an officer of the legislature. If the whole point is to make that person, give that person and that role a much more important and much stronger role, then why not say we're tabling these amendments, we're going to wait for her response to them, and then we'll move forward. That just seems to be the right thing to do. And yet, I can't understand why the government is making this person an officer of the legislature and is then not giving them input in on the final draft of the legislation that will actually govern this new office. That just seems very bizarre to me. To quote the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island in 1998 wrote an item for the Vancouver Sun entitled "Direct Democracy is Fraught with the Perils of Mob Rule." And in it, he made some interesting comments which I think actually apply in this case. And a lot of that was about direct democracy and plebiscites and referendum, and how the potential, if I understood the paper correctly, or what he was trying to say in the paper, the member was trying to say that the problem with direct democracy initiatives like they have in California is that minorities can get pushed out because, and in fact he says, quote, ironically, most citizens' initiatives appear to head in the same direction, more maintaining the status quo than maintaining the status quo or restoring the status quo, more negatives than initiatives. The so-called populists who wish to delay or oppose socioeconomic change could exploit this new form of democracy to protect, promote, or restore their privileged status. He goes on to say, quote, there is no question that our institutions and processes of representative and responsible government need to be reformed. However, we do not wish to wrest power from an arrogant and distant political elite only to transfer it to more unresponsive and unaccountable social elite. Well, yeah, I will after. I got more quotes to read on this, but I will. Don't have no fear. I will table that, Mr. Chair. Actually, I should print the whole thing because it's actually quite an interesting read, but that's the part that relates to this debate at the moment, in my view. Because I think that that's exactly what we do want to avoid. We want to have an election that is seen to be open to as many people as possible. We want to have a democracy that is as free from external influence as possible. We want to have a democracy where everybody feels that they're equal, that we do want to have a democracy where we don't end up with it being controlled by an unaccountable social elite. But isn't that by the government not and by cabinet not allowing the member of the or the chief electoral officer to comment on the changes they propose to such a sweeping piece of legislation, are we not just transferring the power without comment to an unaccountable elite, the government? Because they aren't accountable at this point in time, because this isn't something that's going to a referendum or a plebiscite. In fact, on the same sheet that I'm going to table here, in 2002, the same member said to the Herald, don't kid yourself that a lot isn't happening behind the scenes. Everybody knows that, especially here in Nova Scotia. And he was talking about changes in elections and changes in how parties choose leaders and so forth. Well, that's exactly what everybody's concerned about. I mean, he's absolutely right when he said that. He's absolutely right. And the same, that's why we're concerned today about this. In fact, he could have, if he was on this side of the aisle, he probably would be standing up and saying that exact same thing about this act. And so that's exactly what we're concerned about, is that everything is transparent, that when it comes down to that registration, and we did ask for that a week ago, that the registration of third parties is made public in advance, and we wanted to make sure that that happens so that we do know what's going on behind the scenes, not 3 months after it's all happened. It's exactly what the honourable gentleman said. You know, well, you want to table that? I can table that one because I've read all those now. I think that one of the things that I talked about the other day was the ability for the chief electoral officer to run trials and so forth. And I think that is truly important. That the chief electoral officer is able to do that from that position and run, I can't remember the wording in the act, but it talks about running basically a case study where if you wanted electronic voting or something like that, you could actually run it as a trial and see if it worked. But you know, as a few people have looked closer to the act, one of the things that we notice is that it doesn't actually govern the rules around some of that stuff. And that's a shame, because if it did provide some of the guidelines around how that would happen, it would be much easier for the office of the chief electoral officer to deal with those issues. So, for example, if while I know that the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island, based on his Vancouver Sun article, probably wouldn't approve of this, if the Chief Electoral Officer decided it was worth trying some direct democracy initiatives on a trial basis, there's actually there's no mechanism in the Act to provide guidelines on how that trial would happen, or what the basis of that would be, or how widespread a trial would be allowed, or things like that. Some very basic premises that usually govern how a trial is done. And that bothers me, and it bothers me because I think that I absolutely agree with the government putting that in there, allowing the trials, but I think that there could have been more information and more guidance for that office to determine how that would be allowed. And that seems to be a glaring omission to me, because I think there are opportunities, and I know the honourable member and I disagree on the relative merits of electronic balloting and so forth, but I certainly respect that. And I know that there are differences of opinion, but I also think that it's worth looking at it, because if you look at all the countries that have tried it, very often in local elections, there aren't too many that have tried it nationally, but Australia, Belgium, Brazil, of course Canada, we know that, there's a number of jurisdictions, Estonia, France, Germany, India, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Romania, Switzerland, the UK, Venezuela, and the Philippines, all have, at some level of government, introduced electronic balloting. And not by the way of, sometimes I think we think of the electronic voting machines and the hanging chads from the Florida election in the US, but of course that's a whole different thing than what I'm speaking of when I talk about electronic balloting. I'm talking about what they've done in a number of municipalities here in Nova Scotia as well, in Ontario, with some success. And in fact, in the UK, the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville had asked the question when I talked about it before, whether it increased voter turnout, which I think was it's a very good question. And in fact, it has. And in the UK, without doing much promotion around it, in their trial alone, they found that 12% of the people who voted had never voted before in local elections. And of course, in the US, or the UK, it's a bit different what a local election is. 12% of the people had never voted before, and only came out because of the electronic option. So I think it's, obviously the next general election isn't going to be electronic balloting in Nova Scotia, but it's why these trials are important. 20% of people had indicated that they had had trouble accessing or getting into polling stations. And so when we talk about seniors, the physically challenged, or even young people, trying to get young people out, making it as easy as possible is definitely beneficial in my view. And so, why are we here? We're here because obviously our first choice would be to have this act held over until the fall, when we can, the Electoral Commission can review it and can look at it. They were asked for their input coming along, so why wouldn't they be asked for their input on the final draft? It gives the time. The legislature, by motion, could ask the Chief Electoral Officer to provide to the Assembly her comments on the final draft of the Act as proposed by the Minister. I think that those would be useful tools. And it wouldn't delay anything. There's no, it's not like delaying a budget till the fall session where suddenly, the government has no money. This is only an issue if there was an election imminent, and I think we've all at this point hopefully agreed that there isn't. And so it's interesting because it feels like what we have here is a situation where you have a majority government that's the end of the session, brought in a very important piece of legislation, and brought it in the dying days, or what they hoped would have been the dying days of this session, in hoping that people would be so tired they would just let it go through and there wouldn't be much discussion about it. But obviously that's not what's happened. And as the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island noted on June 27th, 2004, he noted that, majority governments aren't always that accountable. and he's right, and we're seeing it here now. He was speaking about, at the time, he was speaking about how proportional representation generally produces minority governments, and that those are, while they're more insecure, they can be more active, quote, more active and more accountable than majority governments. And you know, perhaps he's right about that. Again, it's just a shame that, it's a shame that, of course, he seems to be so quiet on that issue now that he's in a majority government and on the majority side. It's almost like his feelings have changed now that he's on the majority side, is an MLA on the government benches in the majority government. All of a sudden, his opinions of what he wrote have just changed. It's shocking. And I agree. The member for Pictou East, Pictou West. I'll get it right. I'll get it right eventually. East. See, I had it right the first time. And I have to apologize to that member because I kept, I think, saying his riding name wrong the other day. So he's absolutely right. You shouldn't oppose good legislation, and there's legislation. The member will remember that that we have supported initiatives by the government. There's a number of them that we've supported. The fact is, and there's a number of elements to this act that we supported, and a week ago we were all sitting talking about how to get this through and address the concerns, and then all of a sudden the addressing of those concerns stopped, which was a little bit of a surprise. So I agree with the member. And in fact, that the government brought forward their amendments and then asked us for suggestions, and then those suggestions went nowhere to those amendments. And so here we are with the government's version without any of the changes that were suggested, by not allowing the other day the chief electoral officer to come back up at law amendments. And of course, as was asked by the staff in the Premier's office and other members, they were provided with written copies of the suggestions and the questions we had on certain items, and nothing was brought forward. So, in fact, the government House Leader, well, that's not entirely true, but speaking. Well, Madam Chair, let me address that issue specifically, because since we were asked by the government House Leader to provide a list of things we had questions on, I provided it to him personally, so I know that he received it, and to this date, we have yet to receive a response or clarity to those issues. So, Madam Chair, it's almost incredulous that the member would be chirping over there about the issue that no specific amendments were proposed, since we asked for clarity on some issues to see whether amendments were, to see if specific written amendments were required, and we're still waiting for that response. So when we get the response to those suggested clarities, then then we can talk about what the wording should be. But we're still waiting, and it's been, gee, my goodness, it must have been almost a week now that we've been waiting for a response to those. So, and provided exactly how the government members asked for it. So, and many of the things that we're talking about are exactly the same things that we were talking about then, and we even indicated at the time that if they had reasons or rationale behind some of the issues that we were bringing up, then that would be, that might clarify the issue without the need for amendments. But we're still waiting for those responses, and we will keep waiting for them. And when we receive those responses to the issues that we brought forward, then we can determine whether the clarity and the responses that the government has to those issues are sufficient, or in fact whether specific other amendments are required. But as was suggested by the government, we did give them a list of those concerns, and they said they would get back to us, and we'll continue to wait for them to get back. So, we'll follow the process that they asked for. And so when we look at these issues, I think it's important. It's important to know that you also have a series of. I noticed that today we received on our desks, and I mean this just goes to the issue. Today, this morning, we received on our desks the annotated. I think that would be the correct word, but no, I guess not annotated. Not exactly sure. We've received a new version of the Act which incorporates the suggested amendments, the bill. I'm sorry, the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island is correct. The bill, not the Act until it's made law. But so this morning we received that bill with the changes included in it. This morning we received that. And so, this is just how this process is moving along. At least it's a response to the issue that, last week members in both the opposition caucuses were complaining that they did not have to go back and cross-reference. In fact, the member for Richmond spoke at length the other day about that in law amendments, that having a copy where it was included would address that. I look forward to the day, Madam Chair, when the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island actually gets up and speaks on the record about this bill. But I know that Mr. O'Dempsey hasn't actually sent the approval down yet. So he's still semi on the record. It'd be better than what's going on back there now. So the difference, Madam Chair, is while we'll eagerly listen respectfully to the member who clearly opposes the idea, the issue that he clearly thinks there's something wrong with legislation brought forward being fully debated and discussed in the People's Assembly. I'm sorry he feels that way, but the members on this side of the House certainly don't have that as an issue and don't have any concern about that. And just because that member would like to be rushing out of here in a legislative session that is half the length of the sessions under Liberal governments, that's not my issue. We're at 32 days now. The ones under the last Liberal government were 67, 72. Of course, I tabled those a couple weeks ago when another member tried to suggest that there were short sessions. So. And it was certainly interesting to look at the length of those sessions back then and compare them to even what we have now. And when we start getting up to those, then we can talk about long sessions. When a majority government compares the length of its sessions to those of the previous minority government, it's setting the bar pretty low. So it doesn't take much to get beyond the length of those sessions, and I think the honourable member is quite well aware of that. Well, it wasn't my. The member says it was my love-in with the Tories. It wasn't my love-in with the Tories because I wasn't here. So he can criticize all the people he wants for that, but it certainly wasn't here. But now it seems that they're the ones that are in a rush to get out of here. And then if we want to look at the party that has the love-in with the Tories right now, I think we'd be looking at a different combination. So.
I love you, Keith. Don't worry.
Yeah, that's of course not to speak ill of my good friend, a good friend from for Victoria the Lakes, who spoke very passionately the other day, I might add, on Bill 17, and that's what this is about. It's about the idea that. Something as important as this act should have come. It should have waited. In the government's final bill could have waited till the fall. They could have waited until they saw the chief electoral officer's report. The minister, to his credit, the minister will remember that the legislature, after the last election, unanimously passed a resolution asking for a report. In fact, it's at the beginning of her document. And I don't know why you'd ask somebody for a report and a recommendation if you're going to write your own document anyways, but he admitted, to his credit, that he hadn't, obviously he hadn't seen it until the day before he tabled his. I think that timing's correct, which makes sense, of course, because he would table it as soon as he received it. But one would think that if you're going to ask somebody for their recommendations, then you would wait to craft your document until you've seen that officer's document. I know that that has been the argument from the Minister of Natural Resources, who, when he talked about the natural resources strategy, he said there was the economic analysis and all kinds of other things they wanted first before crafting his response, but that didn't apply here. When it came to the gaming strategy, same thing, you know, the government wanted all the documents in place and that's why it was delayed. So that, fine, but it doesn't apply in this case. With no election imminent, this is an act that could have been crafted over the summer, or the government could have tabled their own act just as they did and let it sit, unless they're going to prorogue the House. And the only reason I can see to prorogue the House before the fall is if a certain former member for Cape Breton North becomes the Lieutenant Governor, and we all want to have the entertainment of seeing him read a throne speech. And I would really like to suggest some wording for that throne speech should he do that, by the way. I'll sell tickets to that.
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth East has the floor.
Thank you. So let's assume that the House won't be prorogued, so the act won't die. And if it did, you just reintroduce it anyways. And so there was an opportunity here, because that still puts it conceivably a year and a half, 2 years, maybe more before an election, anywhere from probably 2 to roughly 3 years of the fall session. That's certainly lots of time to implement any of the changes. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I mean, we're talking about a few months here. We're not talking about years. And so why wouldn't we do that? If you're going to change, as the minister is absolutely right when he says it's been 22 years, this is important. Well, if it's so important, why try and rush it through at the end of a session? It doesn't. It strains credibility that on the one hand you'd say it's so important and deserves feedback, and then on the other hand try and rush it through. It just doesn't make any sense. I understand why the minister couldn't introduce this at the beginning of the session, because of course the chief electoral officer's report wasn't in. So I respect that. I understand that was a limitation as to why it couldn't be introduced on March 31st. But it doesn't explain why it couldn't sit until the fall session. There's another act before the legislature that is sitting until the fall session to address concerns, or I understand that that's why it's sitting is to address concerns. So there's no reason that couldn't have happened here. There's no rational explanation that I've heard or that I can think of as to why there is a pressing need to get this through last week or this week or at any other time. Why wouldn't we expect if you're going to make somebody an officer of the legislature, why wouldn't you give them the respect of allowing them to comment on the final act that will govern their own rules or that will govern their own, how their office will operate? I just think that's something you would do. When the Auditor General's Act came in, I think was the last session, the government paused, allowed the Auditor General to review and make comment on the Act, and he made comments, and if I'm not mistaken, I think he made some minor suggestions for changes, which were incorporated. I think they were all incorporated. To the government's credit, I think they were all incorporated. And yet we're not going to provide the same courtesy to someone that we're going to give equal standing in terms of as an officer of the legislature. That doesn't make any sense to me. There's no pressing issue that requires this to go ahead now. There's no general election imminent unless the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island stages a coup. And I have to take a few members with him, and much like the member for Cape Breton South, I can think of a couple members who maybe be on the list there, but you know, my sense is that's not going to happen. And so why are we concerned? Like, honestly, why are we so concerned about rushing a bill through? You know, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Caucus indicated they would support holding it till the fall when he stood today, and we certainly appreciate his support for letting it hold. You know, and we will, as the days go on, have the opportunity to, you know, to look at some of the amendments. And the member for Argyle is worried about amendments. We'll have lots of time to get to the amendments. Don't worry about that. No, we'll get lots of time.
I think we already clarified that, Lynn.
You got about 11 hours tomorrow to do amendments. So there's no need to, you know, there's no need to rush it through right now. The member for Argyle will have 11 hours or so, or 9 or 11 hours to do his amendments tomorrow. Probably 9, I guess, but hopefully that'll be enough for him to speak to his amendments. And so we're not, you know, I don't think the member needs to be concerned that we won't reach that point, because we will. But at this point, here's the irony in this: this is a democracy, and I know that we're all proud to live in a democracy and see it function. And here we are talking about a bill and discussing a bill that actually is the fundamental tenets of how the democracy works and how the people will be involved in that democracy. So for anybody to suggest that anybody shouldn't be giving their views and speaking about it sort of goes against the basic premise of the whole point of having this act. So let's be absolutely clear. Let's be absolutely clear that to speak to concerns related to the Act and good things, which over the few days that my previous remarks now I have done, it's absolutely appropriate for us to be speaking to those issues because that is what this is about. The Elections Act arguably may be the single, trying to think what, maybe actually the single most important act that the legislature would have on the books in the province, because nothing happens in the legislature without having the proper conduct of elections. And so anything else we do here doesn't even exist without the rules being correct and widely accepted there. And you know, I'll go back to one of my concerns early on, that when we look at, for example, even Section 44, you begin that section by exempting the Act from the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. You know, why does anybody think that's a good thing? You know, and so when we asked almost a week ago for an explanation from the government on that, we've yet to get anything back, other than some chirping comments from the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island, which have not been sanctioned by Mr. O'Dempsey. So the fact is,
Yep, the chirping's been going on for a while.
the thing is, it is new. The wording is new, and in fact, the wording was even changed again through amendments proposed the other day. And it's one of the issues that has been raised as a possible issue. And so, you know, the member opposite will complain that we have not brought forward concerns, which is absolutely false. And, you know, here we are a considerable time later without any responses to try and explain why certain things are there or how they're intended, or perhaps whether it may require a change, because it's entirely possible that the explanations that come forward would be reasonable, would be eminently reasonable. But we have no explanation on many of these items. And that is undoubtedly of concern. We know that there have been issues elsewhere with similar provisions. For example, in Washington in 2009, that became an issue. The Virginia State Board of Elections looked into almost a very similar provision in their Elections Act, and actually had to investigate the distribution of who had voted and who had not voted. And so why wouldn't we be concerned? If that's happened somewhere else just 2 years ago, why wouldn't it be reasonable to ask questions about it here and say, have the issues that came up in another jurisdiction, have they been satisfactorily addressed here? Well, we don't know. There's no evidence to suggest that they have, or that it would be treated any differently. There's very little in there around the protection of the information if that information does go to political parties. And let's talk about independence. We have an independent in the House now, and we've had an independence previously. So, you know, if you look at, and federally, of course, very famously, Bill Casey, well, in many of these cases, independents cannot raise funds until there's an election call. Well, is that right? You know, is it right that an independent, somebody running as an independent in an election cannot actually begin to raise money for an electoral association until after the election is actually called, and that they become a nominated candidate? That may not be right. That may be, and so, you know, when we look at the situation with Bill Casey, they had to get around that by creating a third-party advertising organization called Friends of Bill Casey that could raise money beforehand. But of course, I assume, I'm not entirely sure how they work federally, but I assume that wouldn't have been tax deductible. And so why wouldn't we address that issue here? We've in the last session, we had an independent member. We have one now, and I'm not sure if we had one in the session before that, but there's certainly a tradition that periodically over time there have been independent members. And so why would we want, if we want to encourage people to run, there are people who are going to wish to run who are not members of political parties, and we should be looking at the possibility of sufficient protections and abilities for them to participate equally in the political process and not have to be a member of a political party or elsewise. It's only fair, and maybe it wouldn't be an issue if we never saw independent candidates, but we've seen a few of them, and we've seen many of them not successful, but at least federally, we've seen a few of them successful as well. It also comes down to penalties. One of the other questions that we put forward to the government on this issue that, again, we did not get a response to date is the issue of penalties, which for many of the issues, including the third-party advertising, seem absent from the Act. And if you are going to have provisions around something like third-party advertising in the Act, why would you not ensure that there are sufficient penalties to make a violation of that section of the Act punitive and a deterrent? But it's not in the Act. And we posed that question to the government and have not received a response to that either. That would seem to be a glaring error. But we asked for clarity on that because maybe it's the intent that that's addressed in a different way. We know that in the last election, the chief electoral officer complained that the maximum penalties were too low for one type of issue she was dealing with. But there appears to be nothing specifically mandated in terms of penalties around the amendments that have recently been proposed around third-party advertising. And it's unclear as to why that is. It's unclear why we would not ensure that. And if there is a provision that, or that's addressed in a different way, then it's unclear to me why the government wouldn't have come back to us and said, oh, it is addressed, and this is how it's addressed, and this is where it's addressed. But again, silence, no answer when that was one of the questions that we submitted last week. And so it's in many cases it's the absence of information that becomes of concern. We also know that there are some conflicting issues in the Act. One section of the Act says that they're going to collect the date of birth, including day, month, and year, which of course is important because you need to know if somebody's old enough to vote. But another section of the Act, Section 42 says it collects the whole thing. Section 44 says you only collect the year. But they're both still in the Act as it's currently written. And so is this an oversight? Or you can see why the chief electoral officer might need the day, because if you turn if you become voting age on a particular date that is before or after the election day, then you may or may not be eligible to vote. So obviously more than the year is important. But as it stands now, as it stands now, while one section talks to only providing, while one section only speaks to providing the year, if you go back and actually, depending on how you interpret certain sections of that act, that can be the minimum amount of information provided, but that the parties would have access to all the information that's collected in the previous section. And it's all about what the wording means. And I know that we've had, how many times do we have bills come before this House that correct wording changes, that somebody didn't see, that somebody overlooked? That happens all the time. And that's not anybody's fault. And I'm sure that every government from now until eternity will have to bring forward acts that correct wording changes because they had unintended consequences. But with an Elections Act, I just don't see why we wouldn't sit this until the fall so that we've had all the comments in, that whoever wishes to review the act can do so, that the Chief Electoral Officer can come back and review the act, the government would have the opportunity, the Elections Commission, the Tri-Party Elections Commission would have the opportunity to review each and every one of those suggestions and see exactly what, see whether things that people point out are legitimate or not. And sometimes they won't be. Sometimes there'll be issues that you look at and you say, well, you know, it is what it is and we don't need to worry about that. But I think that is important to know, because, and here's where it becomes an issue, is that during the election and in related to that, is although the political parties have ongoing access to the provision that includes just the year and the name, which I understand, the earlier section creates the register of electors, which includes the full birth date, which the parties have access to during the election period. The way the act is worded now, it's funny that the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island thinks he knows which section I'm talking about and actually pointed out the wrong one. So yes, and so is 42, which is the one I'm talking about. And the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island has just pointed out exactly the issue, which is the fact that there are 3 sections, all dealing with information that's collected, and they're and it's all about clarity. And the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island may think that he has all the answers, and if he does, then maybe he should have ensured that his government. Maybe he should have ensured that his government, when the questions were submitted, including not by us, but by others who have far more expertise than probably anybody in this room on the issue, asked those questions. The government may actually wish to have responded to those, but they still haven't. And that's what this is all about, is not providing their position back on that. And frankly, as the member for Cape Breton South rightly pointed out, non-cabinet ministers are not actually members of the government, and so I'll wait for the official government response and not the response from an MLA who happens to sit on the government benches and thinks he knows everything. Yeah, I don't know, and one of the member over there, the government's deputy house leader says they're all united over there. Yet he should talk to the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island who thinks there's going to be a coup imminently and the government's going to fall, because clearly you're not united on that issue. So, you know, I mean, there is. You know, of course, now the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island would like people to believe he didn't say that the government could fall, went to the media down there when there were plenty of people in the room. And I will apologize to the Minister for Halifax Citadel Island or Halifax Citadel Sable Island, yeah, the Minister, yeah, that I will apologize to him that nobody could hold their laughter in when he said it because it's not, of course, nice to laugh, but maybe he meant it as a joke and it was intended to laugh. But and I'm glad that the member can get great joy. So I think, Mr. Chair, 4 minutes? Oh, I got 4 minutes. Okay. The member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville is concerned that I only have 4 minutes left, but he forgets that I can get up and speak again immediately after if I want. You know, that's the goal. Mr. Chair, at the end of the day, Mr. Chair, the only person that's hurting the opportunity for silence and decorum in this chamber is the chirping from the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, who finds it almost impossible not to say something about every 30 seconds when members on this side are speaking, so anyway, almost made 15 seconds there. He did. In fact, Mr. Chair, the honourable member, for all the ribbing, we give him is a good member and a very fine gentleman. I don't want him to walk out feeling that he was beat up on, and I know that he knows that it's all good-natured, just as we take his ribbing as good-natured. And as a former as a current political science professor, former or current, I'm not sure if he's currently teaching, but you never give up teaching. In fairness, I have no doubt. I do not doubt the fact that the member is open to listening to all points of view and considering all points of view, and I hope that's what he's doing throughout this debate. And considering the fact that members on this side may very well have some good points that deserve consideration, and the fact that many of these questions were asked last week, and we still await answers or clarifications around that, which could have addressed this issue on Thursday. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, that could have addressed that by this point, and yet it's the silence that becomes an issue, which really goes back to his quote of June 27th of 2004, which I said before, which is the issue of accountability of majority governments. And he was right then, and it's right now, that that is one of the challenges when you get a majority government, is that they don't have to be quite as accountable because they can do basically whatever they want. And we've seen that a number of times here, whether it's no different than the killing of the voluntary planning, which we still just don't understand, because you're getting rid of the opportunity for members of the public to have arm's length government. And the only explanation we can seem to get is from the deputy premier, who felt that the advice wasn't in line with government thinking, which I kind of thought was the point. But Mr. Chair, I believe that is the end of my time, so for now, and so I will turn it over to one of my other honourable members, and I thank the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island.
I recognize the member for Preston.
Thank you very much. I really listened with great interest to my colleague as he talked about Bill number 59 and all the comments from the other side of the floor here. And as my colleague from Cape Breton South said, and I'm about the backbenchers on the government side, I can tell you I'm the third longest serving member in this legislature. And I've seen a lot of MLAs come, and a lot of MLAs go. I look around here, there's very, very few of the people that were elected when I was elected. Only two, actually, two. So I left for a short while and I come back. So, you know, those are the ways they go. I went to another constituency by choice, by the way. And when I look around and people think that they're going to be here for a long time, you want to very carefully watch the system and watch what policies your government is putting in place. And you'll soon find when you hit the doors the next time during an election campaign, it might not be as popular as you think you are. And indeed, you may find that indeed you're not a backbencher anymore, you're not a cabinet minister anymore, and indeed that you're not even elected anymore. So as you go through the process, it's quite interesting, and you'll find too the Halifax from, I'm not going to pick on the member here from Halifax, Sable Island, but I would suggest he keep his teaching job because he's going to need a job when the next election's called, as are many of the backbenchers over there now. And if you think it's funny, that's fine. That's fine. But just remember, when all this is over and all the things are done and all the people remember the tax increases and they remember all the other things that were downloaded on them, and they finally realize some of these laws and some of these acts are put in place are going to have a negative effect on Nova Scotia, people aren't going to be too anxious to hire you as a former backbencher in NDP government. And that's going to cause you some personal problems and some serious personal problems. And as the time comes, I would suggest you get your resumes together. You know, there's some people that have jobs and go back to them, but more than likely you'll find out that people don't want to hire a former MLA for whatever reason. Usually something to do with politics and the fact that they don't want to get back in politics again. You know, I've personally fought 8 elections since 1993, and lost one, won 7. So I've learned how to fight elections pretty well, and I've learned to go with the flow with the punches. I sat here with Savage's government when there was very unpopular things that we inherited. You think you've got a problem that you inherited from the Tories when we came to power. I can tell you this province was right on the brink of bankruptcy. It made all kinds of problems that related from that. But people in the public didn't understand that. And many unpopular policies are put in place. Some I didn't agree with, but I was a backbencher at the time. But we stated our case in the caucus, and the stones fell where they would fall, and it did happen. So just when you're talking about this stuff and you're looking at this Elections Act, just remember after the next election, you may be unemployed. And I can say from what I'm hearing in the communities, in my community and other communities, your government isn't very popular out there right now. No matter what the polls say, people are pretty upset. I'm being very, very polite. So, you know, as you go through this process and you look at how you get elected, well, I can tell you some pretty interesting stories over the years, going through 8 elections, and I worked on many elections before that, and of course I've always worked for the Liberal Party, and sometimes I worked for councillors, people trying to get elected to council. But you will find that some people will do almost anything to win an election. And I can give you an example. Last election, and I'm glad they did it, some of the Conservatives candidates' workers were ripping my signs down and using the woods off my sign to put their signs up. That was fine. I didn't mind them doing that because I gained a lot of votes because of that. And it really did pay off. And people come telling me, you know, your sign's being torn down and their signs are being put up with your material. And in the past, we'd voted Conservative, but we're definitely not going to vote Conservative this time because of this activity. I'm not even sure that the candidate even knew about this, but his workers were doing it. So you see so many things happen. I went through another campaign many years ago, and where one individual, that was actually the candidate, went out to people and said, you know, I will give your organization this money if you vote for me. And he was using money from the municipality to do that. And by the time we tracked it all down, the 6 months had gone by, and there's nothing we could do about it. So I think there's going to be an improvement in this bill if we have a longer period of time people doing activity. Clearly illegal, clearly something that shouldn't have been done, but clearly something they got away with. And that can't be acceptable. It's not acceptable in this day and age. You know, you hear stories years ago, and according to my parents and other people I know in the community, that some unscrupulous parties will go around and they would take people's names off of headstones and register them as voters and get someone from outside the community to come in and vote.
And you're concerned about this?
Yes, and I'm very concerned about this because this act right here is going to cause all kinds of problems. And we thought we got away from those kind of things. But when the bill, these big loopholes in it like this bill does, this is going to even be worse. I mean, you get a few people to come vote that supposedly shouldn't be on the voters list, and that is one issue. It's an issue that shouldn't happen. You should only vote once, And I know when I was a child, I can remember people voting in the city, lived in the city, and then come to the rural area and voting again, voting twice in one election for the same party, of course, different candidates, and they got away with it for a while. And I'm glad that hopefully those things don't happen anymore. I haven't heard of any of those things happening in my own area. But those are the things we've really got to be concerned about. You know, this is democracy. We've got to talk about these things. We've got to make the rules fair so anybody can have an opportunity to get elected to this legislature, which is really a privilege to be elected here. And most people never ever have the opportunity to have that privilege. And we shouldn't abuse that. We should work with it and try to do everything we can to help our community and our province and to make it better. And as official opposition party, we've got to make sure we hold the government accountable, whether it's on this bill or whatever bill we're talking about, to ensure that we have the best possible arrangement for people in our community. This government has taken upon itself to increase the debt by $1.3 billion in one crack. And then they say they're paying down the debt, which was a good thing, but that legislation was put in place by us when we were in government. They forget that. They don't mention that. And then, you know, we see that 1,400 user fees go up. That's an expense to people. And people remember that. You talk to people and you go on the doorstep and see what they're saying. And you'll find that they're very upset about this. And then the 2% GST, that's really caused a huge problem for individuals. And then we talk about we had some resolutions today about the tax on gasoline. You know, these are things that the now Premier said there were things that should change. Haven't been changed. No intentions of changing. So as you go over all these things and you see what's happened. And then, you know, we go on to the bill here and we talk about third-party advertising. Well, it seems to me that the NDP party got caught with their hands in the till and get nailed last election with $45,000 worth of donations that weren't appropriate. And those things, they just want to forget those things. So I'm not sure that we can trust this government, trust them with this bill to ensure that we're going to have something that's fair. And fair for Nova Scotians and fair to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to get elected in this province. And I can't see that happening under the present circumstances. There was some discussion here about paid workers that the NDP bring in place. Well, I had one of my campaign workers this time was going around with me volunteering, not being paid, not being put there by some individuals that would possibly be there full-time election campaigners. And we were on one street in my community, and there was a couple of people there with clipboards. We called them the clipboard people, and they were there with the NDP candidate. So my colleague that was with me, he was very anxious to find out who these people were. He didn't know them, didn't know where they were from, and it appeared that they didn't sort of fit into the community like all the other workers that we had seen from the other party. And he went and asked them, he said, "Where are you from?" And they said, "Ontario." "And how long are you going to work here?" "The whole election." Two people. And they went on in great length to talk about it, and it appeared that they were party paid workers for the NDP, working in the area. And you know, it must be interesting. I don't know where they come up with all this money to pay these members, but if you get someone there for 30 days and probably have to pay their expenses, I'm not sure that all of that money even shows up on the election results. When the expenses are put in place, it seems a bit strange. So where does the money come from to put these people up, have the expenses to get them to Nova Scotia, to keep them here in Nova Scotia, and then send them home when they're done? Where's the money come from for that? It doesn't seem like there was enough money spent in my riding by the NDP to cover those costs. So where were they? Were they showing up somewhere else? These are costs that should be accounted for. And it makes you wonder how those are not accounted for and where the money actually came from to pay for these people, where they were never shown there was never donations for them. And indeed, it raises some very serious questions about this whole act. And as you go, they think they moved, they could have moved here, you know, probably moved here for 30 days. That's what it was. But whatever the case was, it was not showing up in the results when you come back with the spending for the NDP in our riding. And I know at the time, I really liked the candidate actually the NDP had in place in my riding the last time. They're a very wonderful lady, and I know that they had a difficulty finding a candidate to run against me last time, but they did very well. They came in second place. Maybe without the paid workers, they wouldn't have done quite that well. And so it's quite interesting. We had no paid workers except election day workers that you have to pay to work at the polls, but that's just a small token that you have to pay the individuals that come that day. So it's a whole different thing than having campaigners that are paid and having election day workers that have to, you have to give a small token to work for you in that day. You know, there's no reason this bill can't be held over to this fall coming. Give a chance for the people in the province to see exactly what's going on and see exactly what effect that's going to have on them and their communities and how money is raised and put together to ensure that you have a fair and reasonable election. You got to remember, a lot of countries in this world, people go on voting day with guns, and some people are shot, some people are scared to go vote because they may get shot, and indeed something else horrible happened to them. And we want to make sure that people feel comfortable when they vote here, it's safe to vote here, and indeed that their vote does count, because our results are getting lower and lower, the number of people voting. It's disinterest. I mean, it's disinterest. People don't believe that they can change anything. And I have conversations with people like this all the time. And indeed, things can be changed. And they will be changed if you work with the individuals in your community, and the community works with the elected member or indeed and gets elected themselves to make change. So there's no reason this can't be held over to this fall. And make sure that it gives time, the fullness of time for people to review it, have some discussion on it, maybe make some amendments that would make the bill a lot better than it is today, and indeed make it fair for elections that anybody can have an opportunity to run in this country, become elected to the province, and whatever other position you can occupy past that. You know, it's a funny thing running for politics, because as you run for politics, it's the only job you pay to get. You actually cost you money to become an MLA. So people out there complaining about the work that the MLAs and they get paid too much, and that's a whole other topic. But the point is, you have to go and you have to present yourself to the community, and you have to convince people that you're the best representative out of the slate of people that are running. So, and in fact, it does cost. It costs you, it costs your family, and it costs all the people you work with and the time to become elected in this province. So if one party, through third-party advertising or any other kind of advertising, has a disadvantage of that, to getting elected, because some organization, a union for instance, puts all kinds of money into an election campaign and indeed does have influence over a party after it gets in place, which seems to be the case with the NDP now. There seems to be quite an influence there from the unions, and you see bills like Bill 100, it makes you wonder, did that money buy something? And if it did, that's not what Nova Scotia is all about and what the democracy is all about. So if you see this happening, and in a large way, and in a way that there seems to be all kinds of sort of direction to push people into voting for in a particular way, and that upsets me, and it upsets a lot of the people in the electorate. And as you see all this stuff go through, and all the changes that this is going to make on election day, and I can tell you, it's a lot of work when you go through this process, and you see you run an election. Say after running 8 elections and working on many before that, it's a big operation, and it's an operation that you have to have very good volunteers for. In our case, I know in the NDP's case, a lot of paid professional workers that they bring in place and put in place, and some volunteers and some people that do volunteer, but indeed, it must be nice to have money come in that you can have paid workers and work on the campaign. I hope it never gets to that point in this province, you know. You never know. But you should get up and talk on that, you know. We'd be interested in your topic and what you have to say, but typically we have, my election campaign, we didn't have any paid workers. We didn't have money to pay them. And if we did have money, we wouldn't have paid them anyway, because we feel that volunteers should come because they believe in what we're doing and believe what Nova Scotia should be like. Not not someone is coming in here and being paid from outside the province to decide what we do in this province and who gets elected in this province. And I think that is not correct. And we go through the as you go through the process and see how all this works, and see how the elections have changed in the last, I would say in the last 10 years, 12 years, it really shows you where we're going. And it's going to be more and more difficult. You're seeing attack ads on television. I think that's an American-side politics, and they appear to work. They appear to work in the last federal election. Is that the right way to advertise and promote things? No, it isn't. And it's a way that people can get elected. And some people would do anything to get power. They would spend money. They would do anything they can to get in power. And is that correct? No, it isn't. This is democracy. It's a time that people should get elected because of what principles they stand on and the kind of job they do in their community prior to getting elected and after they get elected. You know, so as you go through this whole process and we see this bill is like all the bills that the NDP seem to put in here, they try to shove them through and try to get them in under the radar. Like Bill 100, it was a typical example of that. And when you go through that Bill 100 and you see what that impact that's going to have in the province in a long time, this NDP government will be long gone, because by the time the small businesses figure out what you've done to them and how it's going to negatively affect them over time, it's going to be too late for the small businesses. And indeed, that portion of our economy is probably going to be gone. You know, it's difficult to run a business as it is, but when you put some of the regulations in place and make it possible that unions are the ones deciding in a labor dispute, unions, only unions. There's always two sides to a labor dispute. Sometimes the employee's right, sometimes the employer's right. But there's nowhere to go. So if you get union workers there that only believe in that the worker's right and nobody else, you're going to have these appeals, and guess what's going to happen? Employers are going to just say, we've had enough of this. We're going to either close the business and move away from Nova Scotia, or they're just going to close down, lay off the people they have, and you're going to have a lot of people not working. We've already seen the economy reduce. We've seen it reduce. And every time you jack up the tax like you did on the GST, bring it up another 2%, that hurts everybody in the province. And the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Affairs says, you know, nobody's going to lose their house over tax not paying. Well, I'm talking to some people this morning in my office. They're going to lose their home over a very small tax bill. They don't have the money to pay the bill, property tax bill. But yet, the MOU that was canceled by this government in this budget is going to put property taxes up. And it's not me saying this, it's the municipalities saying this over and over and over again. And the more they research it, and the more they look at it, and the more they understand the financial impact, the more they're going to find out that indeed this MOU is going to cost the taxpayers, the property taxpayers are already overburdened with taxes, a whole lot more money than they figured. And if you got an individual, it's a one wage earner in the home or someone that's retired, a single person, they're going to find it impossible to pay their property taxes. Absolutely impossible. And when that happens, they've either got to sell their property if they're fortunate enough to sell it. If the property values stay as high as they are now, they can sell it and get some money out of it. And then what do? Move into a seniors complex, they get an apartment someplace. What do? But that home that they've worked their whole lives to get, their whole lives, and spent so much money getting, will be gone for good. And it's lots of times the people that have these properties want to leave it to their families, so the families get a bit of a head start in life, but that will be gone. And once that asset's gone, you can't replace it. You can never replace it. You know, so as we rush through these bills and push these bills through and try to get things done, you sometimes don't realize what the long-term effect is on people and long-term the economy as well. Because if you get these things put in place, and this thing like the MOU, that is going to have a long-term, far-reaching effect on the province. And long after this government's not in government, because I figure after the next election they're gone anyway, all the backbenchers will be looking for jobs that won't be there. And we see this continue. The people will remember this government, because we're going to keep reminding them about this MOU that was canceled. We're going to keep reminding them when their tax bills come out. that indeed that's the place. And I believe that HRM is going to put it right on the tax bill that this increase in your property taxes because of this government. I think hopefully every municipality does that to remind the people. And when you go door to door, as I said earlier, you're going to get a lot of angry people that are going to meet you at the door and say, well, you didn't put the taxes up here, but you forced the municipality to put it up. And they won't forget the 2% GST. They won't forget the double tax on the gasoline that was supposed to be taken off and the other promises that were broken by this government. So, you know, as we go through this whole arrangement of pushing these bills through and trying to get everything done, and it just doesn't make sense. This is not going to be an election for at least another year and a half, maybe 2 or 3. And if the government hopes to keep in power for as long as they can, they want to go as long as they can, because after the next election, there are going to be a lot fewer members sitting on that side of the House. They'll probably be sitting over here and wondering what they're going to do next and whatever happened to them. And take it from me, I sit in a tough government at the time, but you're going to hear it at the doors. You're going to hear it. And if the people, what I'm hearing in the communities, not just my community, pretty well everywhere as I go, and some people to the point say, what can we do to get rid of this NDP government now? That's a question. And you know, Leonard, too bad that member from Halifax Sable Island isn't here. He could tell us. I mean, it sounded like when he did those comments, and it sounded like there was a revolt happening in the backbenches. It's the only way the government can come down if the members in the backbench of the NDP decide that they're no longer going to support the cabinet and decide to either join our party, which we'd welcome you in if you want to come to our party. We're a very welcoming party. And but they would have to come here. They'd have to come here as Liberals, though. They're not as NDP members. And welcome them here, or they can set as independent with the other member here that they so quickly threw out of their party. It shows that the loyalty that you have as backbenchers from the cabinet and the members of your executive council. It shows you what happens if you say anything. I guess that's why the backbenchers are so afraid to get up and talk about this bill or any bill in this House. So it makes it very difficult to go back and defend in your community why you should get reelected. So it's going to be fun as we see this thing unfold over time. And I can tell you, I've been here a long time. I've seen a lot of people come and go. A lot of people here one term, you know, just one term. And when they get one term, guess what? You know, they have all the benefits for people that were set in place actually by the Internal Economy Board here for members of the NDP that couldn't find jobs afterwards, to help them transition back into a normal life again, because this is not a normal life, as you found out to anyone who's been elected here. And we see what it's like to be an MLA and how difficult it is. And until you get used to doing the job very well and get to know the people and the issues in the community, it's a very difficult job. A job that I very much love and enjoy, and I do love working with the people in my community. It's a wonderful community I do represent, and I'm sure that all members in this House feel the same way about their communities and the people in them. But that's the good part of it. And there's many things you have to deal with every day. You know, it's people that potential losing their homes for tax sale, property tax sale. You see people with health issues that don't quite fit into the system. You see other people with other issues, and the list of issues goes on and on and on. And if you're fortunate enough to be able to help somebody resolve those issues, that makes your day. But when you go through this thing and you see what people do and see what limitations are on some of the times that you can do as an MLA, it's very, very difficult some days. And you think, well, really, should I continue with this, or should I not continue with it? But those days change when you finally see somebody that you've helped and made a difference in their lives. And we do that. I know it's happened to me several times, and probably everyone in this room can talk about the great things. But if the tables are changed on this, and this bill goes through as it's written, very possibly could control who gets elected. And some people may not do this for the right thing. We heard stories about NDP electing people in Quebec that never even visited the riding and got nominated to run the riding, didn't even know where it was at, and got elected. and you tell me that person was really interested in that community? There's no way they're interested in that community. They just put their name on a ballot because they couldn't find anybody. And they went through the process. I mean, is that what it's going to come down to? And then the party with the most money will get the most members, and that won't be because the members want to be here and work for the people. And that could be what's going to happen. It could be what's going to happen. And, you know, when you go through that process and see that happen, it makes you wonder, is our system falling apart? It probably will. Because people are here and they're not here for the right reason. And if you're not here for the right reason, you shouldn't be here. It's that simple. So as you go through the process and see this happen, and if there's opportunities for a particular party or organizations to influence how people vote in a big way, then it's going to be tragic. Our democratic society will fail. It could fail, you know, because of a process like this. And it could be something that's very innocent that happens, but it's a process, and everybody finds loopholes. If there's a loophole, someone will find it. And when they find a loophole, there's going to be a problem. And if there is a problem, then what are you going to do about it? Then you got to try to change the legislation later. And that could be very, very serious. You know, we talk about the bill and the things that happen, the funny things that happen. I can tell you all kinds of different stories I've seen. I've seen probably almost everything when you're election day, everything from people not following the rules and then trying to get it corrected. And there seems to be a minimum number of things that you can do to get these things corrected. But indeed, when you have some of the people that work on the election for other parties and come along and say, well, we're glad to see that you got elected, not our candidate, it makes you wonder what's going on. It really makes you wonder what's going on. So it shows you that sometimes people don't run for politics for the right reason. I'm sure everybody in this room has done that, but that could change over time. We've already seen the federal election, people elected that didn't even know the writing, and the stories that come out of this, and it makes you wonder, how can that happen in this country? But it did. It did happen. All the things that we've had, and all the things that we cherish and we grew up with and wondered about have, you know, come to this point that that's what it is. Who can advertise the most? Who can put the most advertisement out there? That's who wins the most seats? That doesn't seem like it's the way it should be. I remember an awful lot of things. I remember when I was a child, people telling me about stories where people got their bottle of rum, and everybody talks about that. And some people on election day still want the bottle of rum, but they tell them, well, you know, we can't do that because we don't want to go to jail, and they shouldn't do that, those things. And hopefully nobody ever does that anymore, but or a pack of cigarettes or whatever the case might be. But those things are done, and you see, my honorable colleague from Digby says, yeah, right. He must have seen that happen in other areas before his last election and wonder what happened, you know, why this ever happened. Hopefully anyone that does that, they get caught and they get punished properly, and it doesn't happen again. Because it could be in the bill, do you think? Possibly. It might be in the bill, you know. But I'm sure that if it is in the bill, somebody will find out how they can do it, and they will get around it, and it'll be a way that they can go through the system, and indeed, the system will be let down because it did happen. So, you know, and then it's, you know, you talk about someone getting a bottle of rum, and that's what happened in the old days, and it influenced elections. But what about a big union putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into a campaign? Isn't that the same thing? That's exactly the same thing on a larger scale. A larger scale. And imagine how it can influence a vote in an election. Imagine if some big corporation came to either our party, the Conservative Party, and said, here's $100,000 a campaign. How badly the NDP would scream about that, and they would yell about it and cry about it and say, look, you know, you can't do that. But yet they take all this money in from the unions. Same thing. Makes you wonder. There's two sets of rules, I guess. One for people that get money from one source and all the rest of us. So it's interesting when you look at the scenario. And as you go through the whole thing and you see what seems to be happening in our democratic process, it appears that long-term we're going to have some serious problems in this province. We've already got serious problems now. We've got an aging population, and you look at how that's affecting us. And when you talk about that, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he goes to Florida for the winter, and a couple of friends of mine actually, and one of them used to live here in Nova Scotia, and he discovered that by moving his permanent residence to Ontario, where he lives part of the year, and then traveling to the south in the U.S. for the rest of the year, he pays about $200 to $300 a month less in income tax than he pays here. Now, once all the people figure this out, and they realize that bracket creep in Nova Scotia and the personal exemptions are always have a problem here, and our income tax continually rises. There's going to be a lot of people clue into this. They're going to say, why live in Nova Scotia? Pay the high taxes. I can use that money and I can enjoy the money. So why do that? And I didn't even realize it until I talked to my friend. I talked to my friend about that, and these people are Nova Scotians that are leaving the province for that. And it makes you wonder, why? Well, it's our tax structure. It's our tax structure. Well, I'm talking about the bill here, because it goes through the process. Oh, the democratic process, right?